Have you ever witnessed an act of injustice so blatant that time itself seemed to freeze? Picture this: a serene first-class cabin, a poised black woman settling into her seat, and a flight attendant whose misguided sense of authority blinds her to the real power seated right before her. This story unfolds at 35,000 feet, where bias clashes with unseen authority in the most dramatic way. Brace yourself for a journey filled with tension, unexpected twists, and a single, powerful moment that shifts the entire atmosphere of the flight. Buckle up, because this flight is about to change more than one destiny. It was a bright Tuesday afternoon as Flight 9234 prepared for departure from Jefferson International Airport in Charlotte, North Carolina, bound for San Francisco. Jefferson was one of the busiest airports in the country, a place where millions of people crossed paths every year, some sharing fleeting moments, others unknowingly stepping into life-altering encounters. The departure lounge buzzed with its usual symphony of sounds, the rhythmic clicking of rolling suitcases, the chatter of business travelers immersed in last-minute calls, and the excited squeals of children heading off on family vacations. Among the early boarders was Naomi Carter, a tall, elegantly dressed black woman in a tailored navy pantsuit. Her confident posture exuded authority, but there was a quiet warmth in her eyes as she exchanged friendly nods with fellow passengers. Few would have guessed the influence she wielded within one of the most powerful organizations in aviation, the National Aviation Safety Board, NASB. Settling into her plush first-class seat, Naomi exhaled a quiet sigh. The past 3 days had been grueling. High-stakes meetings, regulatory discussions, and long hours reviewing safety protocols. Though exhausting, her work was essential. She had dedicated her career to ensuring the highest standards in aviation, but she had no idea that before this flight even touched down in California, her commitment to fairness and protocol would be tested on a deeply personal level. As passengers trickled into their seats, the first-class cabin carried the usual mix of personalities. A well-dressed older couple softly discussed their upcoming Mediterranean cruise. A young entrepreneur paced the aisle, murmuring last-minute instructions into his Bluetooth headset. Meanwhile, Naomi idly flipped through an in-flight magazine, barely registering the glossy pages filled with ads for luxury watches and tropical getaways. Then, the first-class flight attendant entered. Her name tag read Victoria Hayes, and everything about her, from the pristine crispness of her uniform to her flawlessly pinned hair, suggested years of experience. But there was an unmistakable sharpness to her demeanor, her gaze sweeping the cabin with the intensity of someone expecting a problem before one even existed. As Victoria moved through the rows, her eyes landed on Naomi. A slight frown flickered across her face before she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. She handed out pre-departure drinks to every passenger, except Naomi. Naomi barely noticed at first. She was engrossed in an article discussing upcoming NASB safety initiatives. But fate had already begun setting the stage for an encounter that would call into question more than just her right to sit in first class. Just as the last passengers boarded and the cabin doors prepared to close, Victoria approached Naomi's seat with an air of controlled scrutiny. "Ma'am," she said, her tone polite but firm, "may I see your boarding pass?" Naomi looked up, slightly surprised. Of course. Reaching into her jacket pocket, she retrieved the small slip of paper and handed it over. Victoria examined it carefully, her brow knitting together as if something was amiss. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked, keeping her voice calm. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "I just need to verify everything is correct." After a moment of tense silence, she handed the ticket back, forcing a stiff smile. "Everything seems fine. Enjoy your flight, Miss Carter." With that, she turned sharply and walked away. Naomi's instincts flickered with unease. She had spent years traveling for work, encountering flight crews of all temperaments, some friendly, some indifferent, and a few who wielded their authority unnecessarily. She chose to give Victoria the benefit of the doubt, but she had a sinking feeling this wasn't the last time her seat would be questioned. The aircraft taxied onto the runway as the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers and announcing the expected flight duration. Naomi leaned back against her headrest, letting the hum of the engines soothe her. Outside her window, The airport's bustling tarmac stretched out, a carefully choreographed dance of ground crew members directing aircraft with glowing orange wands, baggage carts weaving between planes, and jets lining up for takeoff. It was a sight Naomi had always loved, a reminder of why she had dedicated her career to aviation safety. But her appreciation for the moment was short-lived. Shortly after takeoff, the flight attendants began their first-class service, moving through the aisle with trays of beverages and small snack plates. Victoria moved methodically from the front of the cabin toward Naomi's row. But when she reached Naomi's seat, she walked right past. No drink, no snack, nothing. Across the aisle, the older couple exchanged puzzled glances but said nothing. Naomi furrowed her brow. It was highly unusual for a first-class passenger to be skipped. Perhaps it was an oversight, maybe a simple mistake. Her instincts, however, whispered something else. Determined not to assume the worst, Naomi lifted a hand slightly, hoping to catch Victoria's attention. But the flight attendant, despite clearly seeing her, turned away. Naomi felt an unsettling tightness in her chest. This wasn't just an accident. It was deliberate. She sat still for a moment, processing the situation. Years of navigating high-stakes environments had taught her patience, but she also knew when to push back. Moments later, another flight attendant, a younger woman named Isabel Torres, passed by. Naomi seized the opportunity. "Excuse me," Naomi said gently. "I haven't received any service. Could I get a glass of water, please?" Isabel blinked in surprise. "Oh, of course, ma'am. My apologies." She hurried to pour Naomi a drink, offering a warm, genuine smile. But before she could hand over the glass, Victoria appeared out of nowhere, her voice clipped. "I'll handle this, Isabel." Isabel hesitated, then reluctantly stepped back. Victoria's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I need to verify your ticket again." Naomi's breath hitched slightly. "I already showed it to you." Victoria extended a hand, her tone now carrying the weight of authority. "I'll need to check it again." As Naomi pulled out her boarding pass for the second time, a strange hush settled over the cabin. Other passengers, sensing the tension, began to take notice. Naomi had traveled enough to recognize what was happening. She wasn't being asked for her ticket. She was being challenged for her place in first class. And if Victoria thought Naomi was going to back down, she was sorely mistaken. Naomi Carter had experienced many things in her years of traveling, but this moment felt different. It wasn't just an oversight. It wasn't just poor service. It was deliberate. As she raised her hand to get Victoria Hayes' attention, the flight attendant glanced in her direction, then quickly turned away, pretending not to notice. A pit formed in Naomi's stomach. She had been ignored once, but now it was clear that this was not an accident. Several minutes passed before another flight attendant entered the aisle, a younger woman with a warm, open demeanor. Her name tag read Isabel Torres. Naomi saw her as an opportunity to get what she had been denied. She reached out, lightly tapping Isabel's arm. "Excuse me," Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. "I haven't received any service. Could I please get a glass of water?" Isabel blinked, startled. "Oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am. Of course." Her apology seemed genuine as she quickly poured a glass of water and handed it to Naomi with a reassuring smile. But before Naomi could take a sip, Victoria materialized beside Isabel. Her expression was sharp, her voice clipped. "I'll take it from here." Victoria placed a firm hand on the water pitcher, cutting off Isabel's attempt to assist. The younger attendant hesitated, her gaze flickering between Naomi and her superior. It was clear she felt uncomfortable. Isabel took a small step back, giving Naomi an almost apologetic look before retreating. Victoria squared her shoulders and tilted her chin upward. "Ma'am, I need to verify your boarding pass again." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. "I already showed it to you." Her fingers moved to her jacket pocket, retrieving the slip of paper once more and handing it over. Victoria studied it with exaggerated scrutiny, turning it as if searching for something out of place. Then she uttered words that sent a cold wave of disbelief through Naomi. "We've had reports of passengers from the main cabin sneaking into first class," Victoria said, her voice laced with false politeness. "I'm sure you understand." A flicker of heat rose in Naomi's chest. "I see," Naomi responded evenly, holding her composure. "However, my ticket is valid. This is my seat." Victoria's tight smile didn't waver. "Yes," she said smoothly, "but I'll need to verify it with the gate agent." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked briskly toward the galley, disappearing behind the curtain. The older couple across the aisle exchanged hushed whispers, casting sympathetic glances at Naomi. Behind her, the young entrepreneur who had been busy with his phone earlier now spoke in a low voice to his seatmate. "This is ridiculous," Naomi heard him say. "I've flown first class 100 times. I've never seen someone questioned like this." A small wave of validation coursed through Naomi. She wasn't imagining this. Others saw it too. But beneath that validation was something deeper. A weight that had been placed on her shoulders long before this flight. Could it be that Victoria simply didn't like her? Or was there something more insidious at play? Naomi had faced these moments before. Moments of quiet doubt cast by others, moments when her presence was questioned in spaces where she had every right to be. The raised eyebrows in boardrooms, the subtle hesitations before service in high-end restaurants, the occasional unwelcome remark dressed as curiosity. It never got easier. And here, at 35,000 feet, she was being confronted with it again, undeniable, sharp, and public. 10 minutes passed before Victoria returned, her posture rigid, her face unreadable, but her voice carried through the first-class cabin loud and clear. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin." A collective hush fell over the passengers. Naomi's grip on her armrest tightened slightly, but her expression remained steady. "That's impossible," she said, keeping her tone measured. "My ticket is valid. If there's any confusion, I suggest you check the passenger manifest." Victoria's expression darkened. "I have checked," she said curtly, "and there is no record of you being assigned to this seat. You need to gather your belongings now." Gasps rippled through the surrounding rows. The older woman across the aisle leaned forward. "We saw her boarding pass," she said, her voice quivering with disbelief. "She was here before the cabin even filled up." Victoria's gaze flickered toward the woman, her tone clipped. "I appreciate your input, ma'am, but this is an airline matter." By now, passengers in surrounding seats were watching closely. Heads turned. Curious eyes peered over seatbacks. Even Isabel had stepped out from the galley, looking between Naomi and Victoria with a mix of concern and uncertainty. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Naomi squared her shoulders. "I will not move," she said firmly. "My name is Naomi Carter, and this is my assigned seat. If you're still unsure, I suggest you call the gate agent." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin, grim line. For a moment, it seemed like she was weighing her options. Then she turned, walking briskly toward the front of the cabin. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, advising passengers to remain seated due to mild turbulence ahead. Victoria took the phone from the galley and spoke in hushed tones, likely to the head of cabin services, or perhaps someone on the ground. Naomi remained still, her heartbeat steady despite the tension in the air. She didn't want to reveal her position at the National Aviation Safety Board, NASB, just yet. There was still a chance to de-escalate this before it spiraled further. But Victoria seemed determined to push things forward. 20 minutes later, as the seatbelt sign flickered on due to the mild turbulence, Victoria returned. This time, there was no pretense of politeness. "Ma'am, if you do not comply, I will have no choice but to notify the authorities upon landing." A murmur swept through the cabin. Naomi exhaled slowly, her patience thinning. She knew the power flight attendants had. Post-9/11 security policies granted them wide discretion to remove passengers deemed disruptive. And if Victoria chose to escalate this, the situation could worsen quickly. But Naomi had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and risen too high in her career to back down now. She would give Victoria one last chance to correct her mistake. And if she refused, Naomi had no problem letting her know exactly who she was. Tension gripped the first-class cabin like an invisible vice, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on the passengers. Naomi Carter sat still, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, yet beneath her calm exterior, a fire smoldered. She had spent her entire career ensuring fairness and safety in the aviation industry, writing policies, overseeing regulatory compliance, and pushing for improved standards. And yet, here she was, being publicly humiliated by a flight attendant who refused to believe she belonged in her own seat. The sheer irony of it was maddening. "I've told you," Naomi said, keeping her voice composed despite the frustration creeping into her tone. "This is my assigned seat. If you have any doubts, I strongly suggest you check the passenger manifest." Across from her, Victoria Hayes stood rigid, her arms crossed, a mask of forced authority on her face. "I have already checked," Victoria said, her tone laced with thinly veiled hostility. "I'm giving you a final warning." The murmurs of the other passengers grew louder. By the galley, Isabel Torres, the younger flight attendant, hovered uncertainly. She had been watching the situation unfold, clearly uncomfortable with her superior's actions. Her eyes flickered to Naomi, then back to Victoria, her lips pressed into a tight line as if debating whether or not to intervene. Meanwhile, across the aisle, the older couple who had been quietly observing the conflict sat in visible dismay. The woman, whose name Naomi had learned was Eleanor, leaned forward slightly. "We saw her boarding pass," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "She was seated before most of us even boarded. I don't understand why you keep questioning her." Victoria's gaze snapped toward Eleanor, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am," Victoria said stiffly, "but this is an internal matter." Naomi's fingers curled slightly over the armrest. An internal matter. That was the language of someone trying to silence objections. Behind her, the young entrepreneur who had been furiously typing on his phone whispered to his seatmate. "This is insane," Naomi heard him murmur. "I've never seen someone get treated like this in first class." She wasn't alone in this. Others saw it too. But knowing that didn't lessen the sting of the moment. Naomi took a slow breath, grounding herself. This wasn't just about her personal dignity. This was about something larger. "Miss Hayes," Naomi said, measuring her words carefully, "if you still believe my seat is in question, then I suggest you bring the gate agent here to verify the manifest." Victoria's jaw tightened. "There's no need for that," she replied. "You need to comply with my instructions." Naomi's patience was wearing dangerously thin. "And if I don't?" she asked, her voice calm but unwavering. Victoria straightened, her tone sharpening. "Then I'll have no choice but to notify the authorities upon landing." A hushed gasp spread through the cabin. Naomi felt a familiar frustration surge within her. She knew how much discretionary power flight attendants had in post-9/11 air travel. If Victoria framed her as a disruptive passenger, things could escalate quickly. But Naomi wasn't just a passenger. She was a director at the National Aviation Safety Board, NASB, an agency responsible for ensuring that airline policies, including those governing passenger treatment, were fair and just. And she wasn't about to be bullied out of her seat. She glanced at Eleanor and her husband, their concerned expressions mirroring what she felt. Across the aisle, Isabel took a hesitant step forward, as if wanting to say something but stopping herself at the last moment. Naomi inhaled deeply. She had given Victoria every chance to back down. Now it was time to end this. Slowly, Naomi reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and withdrew a slim black case. She held it in her palm for a moment, then calmly flipped it open, revealing the gleaming golden badge inside. The air in the cabin seemed to still. "I tried to resolve this amicably," Naomi said, her voice measured but firm. "But since you refuse to accept my valid boarding pass, let me show you something else." Victoria's gaze flicked to the badge, her posture stiffening. Passengers craned their necks, trying to get a glimpse of what Naomi was holding. Another form of identification isn't going to change the fact that. Victoria started, but her voice faltered as she processed the words etched on the badge. National Aviation Safety Board Director Naomi Carter. A ripple of shock passed through the cabin. The entrepreneur behind Naomi let out a quiet, stunned, "Whoa." Eleanor's mouth parted slightly, as if she were seeing the situation through an entirely new lens. Victoria, meanwhile, had gone completely pale. Naomi held the badge at eye level, her voice cool and unyielding. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said. "I am a director at the NASB, the agency responsible for overseeing aviation safety and regulatory compliance in this country." Victoria blinked, her lips parting as if to say something, but no words came out. "If you had properly checked the passenger manifest," Naomi continued, "you would have seen that I purchased this first-class ticket weeks ago." A murmur swept through the cabin. Eleanor clapped a hand over her mouth, while the entrepreneur behind Naomi exchanged wide-eyed glances with his seatmate. For the first time since this confrontation had begun, Victoria looked unsure of herself. She stammered, her bravado cracking. There must have been a mistake in the system. I apologize. Naomi arched a brow. A mistake? Her words weren't loud, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. A mistake. Was it a mistake when Victoria ignored her during service? Was it a mistake when she demanded Naomi's boarding pass a second time, and then a third? Was it a mistake when she publicly accused Naomi of taking a seat she had rightfully purchased? If so, it was a very specific kind of mistake, the kind that only seemed to happen to people who looked like her. Naomi exhaled slowly, locking eyes with Victoria. You should apologize, she said, her voice unwavering. But more importantly, you need to correct your behavior, because no passenger, regardless of who they are, should ever be treated this way. Victoria took a half-step backward. Her confidence had crumbled, and now she was scrambling to regain her footing. I need to, she hesitated. I need to speak with the captain. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode toward the cockpit, disappearing behind the curtain. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, the passengers erupted into hushed chatter. Eleanor leaned closer to Naomi, her eyes still wide. Are you all right, dear? She whispered. That was unbelievable. Naomi let out a slow breath, nodding. I'm fine. Thank you for speaking up. From behind, the entrepreneur gave Naomi a subtle thumbs up. That was wild, he murmured. She's definitely in trouble now. Naomi didn't reply, her gaze drifting toward the front of the cabin. She could only imagine what was happening behind the cockpit door. As a director at the NASB, Naomi had the power to file a complaint that would trigger a full-scale investigation. Victoria's actions weren't just a matter of bad customer service. They were a direct violation of passenger rights. The question was, how would the airline respond? And more importantly, how far was Naomi willing to go to make sure this never happened again? For the first time since the confrontation began, Victoria Hayes took a step back. Her confidence wavered, the authority she had clung to now slipping through her fingers. She had pushed too far, and she knew it. The cabin was utterly silent except for the steady hum of the engines and the whoosh of the ventilation system. All eyes were on her. Passengers who had witnessed the entire ordeal, their expressions ranging from shock to disapproval. Victoria's mouth parted as if to speak, but no words came. Her gaze darted from Naomi Carter's badge to the faces around her, as if searching for a way out. Then, as though jolted by an internal command, she stiffened. I need to speak with the captain, she stammered. Without waiting for a response, she turned abruptly and hurried toward the cockpit, her shoes clicking sharply against the floor as she disappeared behind the curtain. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the murmurs erupted. Eleanor, the older woman who had stood up for Naomi earlier, leaned over again, her voice hushed but urgent. Are you all right, dear? She whispered. That was unbelievable. Naomi let out a slow breath, forcing a small, tired smile. A mix of relief and lingering anger churned inside her. I'm fine, she assured Eleanor. Thank you for speaking up. From behind, the young entrepreneur leaned forward, shaking his head in disbelief. That was some serious drama, he murmured. I've never seen a flight attendant act like that. She's in deep trouble now. Naomi nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She was already picturing the scene unfolding behind the curtain. The captain, likely someone with decades of flight experience, would now be listening as Victoria attempted to explain why she had publicly humiliated a director of the National Aviation Safety Board over a seat she had rightfully purchased. Naomi had the power to escalate this further, to file an official report that could launch a full investigation. The question was, how would the airline respond? Would they treat this as the serious infraction it was? Or would they attempt to brush it under the rug with a half-hearted apology? 10 excruciating minutes passed before another flight attendant, Isabel Torres, hesitantly approached Naomi's seat. She looked nervous but carried a glass of water and a damp towel, offering them with both hands. I'm so sorry, Isabel whispered, her voice filled with sincerity. I didn't realize what was going on. Naomi accepted the water gratefully, offering a small nod. It's okay, Isabel. It's not your fault. Isabel bit her lip, glancing toward the front of the cabin where Victoria had disappeared. She hesitated, lowering her voice even more. She doesn't speak for all of us. Naomi met Isabel's gaze and saw the genuine regret in her eyes. "I know," Naomi assured her. She took a sip of the water, letting the coolness soothe the heat still simmering beneath her skin. No, Victoria didn't speak for all flight attendants. But that didn't change the fact that she had held power in this moment, and she had chosen to wield it unfairly. Moments later, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harris speaking," came a measured voice. "We have been made aware of a situation in the first-class cabin. I want to assure you that passenger safety and comfort are our top priorities. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we address this matter. Thank you." Naomi exhaled slowly. So the captain was now fully informed. That meant a resolution was coming. But what kind of resolution? Would Victoria be removed from service for the remainder of the flight? Would she be ordered to apologize in front of the entire cabin? Would Naomi have to take further action to ensure this didn't get buried? Eventually, Victoria reappeared. Her shoulders were not as rigid as before, and there was something different about her demeanor. The confidence, the forceful authority, it had all been chipped away. She approached Naomi's seat slowly, hesitated, then cleared her throat. "Miss Carter," she began quietly, her voice lacking its previous sharpness, "I'd like to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier." Naomi remained silent, waiting. Victoria continued, though her words came out rushed and unconvincing. "The system showed an error," she said, forcing a small, stiff smile. "And I misunderstood the situation." Naomi studied her. She wasn't sure whether the flight attendant truly felt any remorse, or whether she was simply doing damage control now that she realized who Naomi was. "I accept your apology," Naomi said evenly. "But I need to say this. Your behavior was unprofessional and discriminatory. I showed you my valid boarding pass multiple times, yet you continued to question me in front of this entire cabin. You assumed I didn't belong here, with no evidence to support that assumption." Victoria's face flushed. She started. But Naomi wasn't finished. "You accused me, without proof, of taking a seat that wasn't mine," Naomi continued, her voice firm but controlled. "You humiliated me in front of dozens of passengers, and now you expect a vague apology to erase all of that?" Victoria swallowed hard, her confidence completely unraveled. She mumbled something about airline policy and system glitches, but even she didn't sound convinced. Across the aisle, Eleanor and her husband watched the exchange, their disapproving expressions saying what they didn't need to verbalize. The young entrepreneur behind Naomi scoffed quietly, shaking his head. Victoria lingered for a moment longer before bowing her head slightly. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Naomi let out a long breath, sinking back into her seat. She had won the battle, but what about the war? On one hand, her sense of justice demanded more than a vague apology. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger systemic problem that allowed flight attendants like Victoria to act on their biases without consequence. On the other hand, a part of her wanted to move on. She had a major aviation conference to attend in San Francisco the next day, one where she would be addressing airline executives and safety regulators. If she formally reported this incident, it would undoubtedly spread through her professional network, possibly even making headlines. Was that the outcome she wanted? Even as she pondered the question, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about her. If she stayed silent, what would stop Victoria, or any other flight attendant, from doing the same thing to someone else? With that realization, Naomi made up her mind. She would handle this with fairness but firm accountability. This flight might have been turbulent in more ways than one, but Naomi would make sure real change came out of it. As the plane cruised steadily above the clouds, the first-class cabin settled back into an uneasy normalcy. Eleanor and her husband exchanged quiet words, occasionally glancing toward Naomi with sympathy. Isabel returned with the meal service, ensuring that Naomi was finally served properly. And Victoria? She kept her distance. Every so often, she passed through the aisle, but she avoided direct eye contact with Naomi. Her usual authoritative stride was gone, replaced by something almost hesitant. Naomi had no doubt that she was replaying the events in her mind, wondering what repercussions she would face once the plane landed. And there would be repercussions. Naomi would make sure of it. Because if there was one thing she had learned over the years, It was this: if you don't challenge injustice when it happens to you, it will happen to someone else. And she wasn't about to let that happen. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as the final stretch of the flight passed in relative quiet. Naomi Carter sipped her coffee, eyes scanning the regulatory documents she had intended to review during the trip. Ordinarily, she would have been immersed in the details: policy updates, compliance reports, safety regulations. But her mind kept drifting back to the confrontation that had unfolded only an hour earlier. The weight of it pressed into her shoulders. She had been wronged. There was no question about that. The National Aviation Safety Board, NASB, where she served as a director, was responsible for ensuring airline staff were trained not just in safety procedures, but also in bias awareness and passenger relations. And yet, despite her own work in pushing for fairer regulations, she had become a victim of the very system she helped oversee. It was almost laughable, because this wasn't something she could simply brush off. She had a responsibility, not just to herself, but to the countless others who might one day find themselves in her position. The thought hardened her resolve. She would follow through, no matter how uncomfortable it made her. Sometime after the meal service, exhaustion settled in, and Naomi drifted into a light sleep. Her mind played out fragments of the day: the accusatory tone of Victoria Hayes, the murmur of shocked passengers, the sharp gleam of her NASB badge catching the cabin lights. She dreamed of endless airport gates, uniformed flight attendants, and the rhythmic swirl of white clouds beyond an airplane window. When she woke, the plane had begun its descent. A glance at her watch told her they were about 90 minutes from San Francisco. She clicked on her overhead reading light and pulled out a small leather notebook from her bag. Years of experience had taught her that documentation was everything. She jotted down the key details: time of boarding, Victoria's repeated demands for her ticket, statements from witnesses, including Eleanor and her husband, the silent but watchful eyes of nearly every first-class passenger. A well-documented report was often the difference between swift justice and bureaucratic limbo. As she flipped through her notes, her gaze drifted toward the forward galley. Victoria stood there, refilling coffee pots, her posture stiff and her face carefully composed. For a brief second, their eyes met. There, behind Victoria's guarded expression, Naomi saw a complicated mix of shame and resentment. Did she fully grasp the gravity of what she had done? Or was she simply counting the minutes until the flight landed, hoping to escape further fallout? About an hour before landing, Isabel Torres returned to Naomi's seat. This time, she carried a tray with a freshly brewed cup of tea. Setting it down gently, she said, "Miss Carter, this is on the house. I thought you might want something calming before we land." Naomi looked up, momentarily caught off guard. Then she saw the sincerity in Isabel's eyes. A small, genuine act of kindness. She nodded, offering a grateful smile. "Thank you, Isabel. I appreciate it." Isabel hesitated for a moment, then leaned in slightly. "I just want you to know, not all of us think or act like Victoria. She's been under a lot of stress, but that doesn't excuse her behavior. I'm truly sorry you had to go through this." Naomi studied her for a second before replying, "Your kindness means a lot. Thank you for acknowledging it." As Isabel walked away, Naomi wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat soothe the tension in her fingers. The gesture, however small, reminded her that while systems sometimes failed, individuals could help mend them. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our initial descent into San Francisco. Please ensure your seatbacks are upright and your tray tables are stowed." Outside, the sprawling city lights of San Francisco flickered in the golden glow of the setting sun. Passengers stirred awake, stretching and tidying up their spaces. Then, Victoria appeared once more. This time, she moved down the aisle, ensuring carry-ons were properly stowed. When she reached Naomi's row, she hesitated. Clearing her throat, she spoke just loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Miss Carter, once again, I apologize. I hope we can put this behind us." Naomi studied Victoria's face. Her tone wasn't quite humble, but it was different, lacking the hostility she had carried before. Was it remorse or just fear of retribution? It was difficult to tell. Naomi's response was calm but firm. "I appreciate the apology, but I will be filing a report. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Victoria gave a small nod, as though accepting the inevitable. Her eyes flickered with something almost like regret, but she said nothing more before walking away. Naomi let out a slow breath and turned back toward the window as the plane continued its smooth descent. The touchdown was gentle, a smooth landing that barely rattled the overhead bins. But Naomi's heart beat a little faster, knowing that the real confrontation wasn't over. It had simply shifted to the ground. As the seatbelt sign pinged off, passengers stood, gathering their belongings. Many cast curious glances in Naomi's direction, silently acknowledging what had transpired. Eleanor and her husband paused by her row, their expressions kind. "Take care, dear," Eleanor said softly. "You handled that with such grace." Naomi smiled. "Thank you for speaking up." Behind them, the young entrepreneur gave her a thumbs up, a subtle but clear show of support. Victoria, meanwhile, busied herself with the overhead compartments. She avoided Naomi's gaze, though Naomi could sense the tension radiating off her. Isabel, on the other hand, offered Naomi a genuine smile and a quiet, "Take care." As the line of passengers slowly filed out, Naomi remained seated. She wasn't leaving just yet. She intended to speak to someone in authority. The injustice she had faced wouldn't be erased just because the flight had ended. She could feel a knot in her stomach, a mixture of anticipation, anger, and certainty. Despite her composed demeanor, the indignity of the experience weighed heavily on her. But she reminded herself why she was doing this. She wasn't just another passenger. She was a director at the NASB, and she had a responsibility to ensure this never happened to another person again. That knowledge propelled her forward. As she stepped through the jet bridge, she spotted a gate agent waiting for her. The woman recognized her name immediately, no doubt briefed by the captain or another crew member. Naomi took a breath. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. As Naomi Carter stepped off the plane, she barely had time to process the shift from the tense atmosphere of first class to the bustling terminal of San Francisco International Airport. A woman was waiting for her near the gate. A crisp uniform and name tag identifying her as Chelsea Monroe, the airline's on-duty supervisor. "Miss Carter," Chelsea said, offering a professional but cautious smile. "I'm the on-duty supervisor for this flight. If you have a moment, we'd like to discuss your experience on board." Naomi nodded, relieved that someone had been appointed to handle the situation. Chelsea led her to a quieter seating area near the gate, away from the stream of passengers collecting their luggage and rushing to their next destinations. They sat across from each other, and Chelsea folded her hands on the table. "First, I want to sincerely apologize on behalf of the airline," she began, her voice measured yet earnest. "We've been informed about what happened in first class, and I want you to know that we take this situation very seriously. Our priority is ensuring that all passengers feel respected and safe." Naomi appreciated the directness. "Thank you for addressing this quickly," she replied. Reaching into her bag, she retrieved the small leather notebook she had used on the flight. She flipped through the pages, scanning the bullet points she had written down. "I have documented everything," Naomi continued, her tone professional. "I am prepared to file an official complaint with both the airline and the National Aviation Safety Board, NASB." Chelsea nodded. "We understand. Please rest assured that we will cooperate fully. We plan to conduct an internal review of Ms. Hayes' conduct and also verify the passenger manifest to determine how this situation escalated the way it did." Naomi took a measured breath. It was a relief to hear that they were taking the matter seriously, but she also knew from experience that promises were easy to make. It was the follow-through that truly mattered. Chelsea slid a formal complaint form across the table. "If you're comfortable, please document your account here in as much detail as possible," she said. Naomi picked up the pen and began writing. She listed everything: Victoria Hayes' repeated demands, her false accusations, and the disrespectful treatment in front of an entire cabin of passengers. She also included the names of witnesses who might be willing to corroborate her story. Eleanor and her husband, the young entrepreneur seated behind her, Isabel Torres, who had treated her with professionalism despite the circumstances. As Naomi wrote down the final sentences, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She knew that her position at the NASB might give this complaint more visibility, but this wasn't just about her. Any passenger, regardless of status, deserved fair treatment. She handed the completed form back to Chelsea. Chelsea skimmed the document before nodding. "Miss Carter, we will investigate this thoroughly," she reiterated. "We may need to contact you for additional information." She hesitated, then added, "In the meantime, if there's anything we can do, refunds, future flight credits, please let me know." Naomi paused, then shook her head. "I'm not interested in freebies, Chelsea," she said evenly. "What I want is for your staff to receive a clear message that prejudice, whether conscious or unconscious, is unacceptable." She leveled a firm gaze at the supervisor. "If Miss Hayes did this to me, she could do it to someone else. That's what needs to change." Chelsea's posture straightened. She nodded solemnly. "Understood, Miss Carter. We'll make sure your concerns are taken seriously." As Naomi stood to leave the gate area, something caught her eye. Victoria Hayes. She was standing off to the side, speaking quietly with another airline employee, likely another supervisor. But she looked different. The usual air of unshakable authority was gone. Her shoulders drooped and her expression was unreadable, though Naomi noted how she stared at the floor rather than making eye contact with anyone. For a brief moment, a flicker of sympathy stirred within Naomi. She had never relished seeing someone's career fall apart, even when it was their own doing. But the memory of Victoria's accusatory glare, her dismissiveness, her refusal to believe the truth, all of it was still too fresh to evoke much pity. Naomi turned away. This wasn't about personal revenge. It was about accountability. By the time Naomi made her way through the airport and toward the rideshare pickup area, her phone buzzed with messages. A colleague checking if she had arrived safely, a friend reminding her about dinner plans, an ASB associate confirming the time of her keynote speech the next day. She sent back short, generic responses. She wasn't ready to unpack the ordeal yet. Sliding into the back of a black sedan, Naomi let out a slow breath, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. Outside, the San Francisco skyline stretched before her, bathed in the warm glow of the evening sun. The city's carefree energy stood in stark contrast to the tension she had endured just hours earlier. Still, one thought crystallized in her mind. This wouldn't just be a blip in her memory. She would follow through until she was certain meaningful action had been taken. Later that night, after checking into her hotel and freshening up, Naomi decided to scroll through her phone. That's when she saw it. The young entrepreneur from the flight had posted a detailed thread on social media. He hadn't named her, but he had described the situation vividly. A black woman in first class being targeted by a flight attendant, the repeated ticket checks, the public accusation of fraud, and finally, the dramatic reveal of her NASB credentials. Within hours, the post had gone viral. Thousands of comments, thousands of retweets. Some users speculated about Naomi's identity. Others called out the airline, demanding accountability. Naomi sighed, feeling an odd mix of dismay and validation. She hadn't wanted the situation to become a spectacle, but she knew that public scrutiny could force the airline to act decisively. She typed a quick note to her media relations contact at the NASB, alerting them to the situation, then set her phone aside. Tomorrow, she had to focus on her scheduled presentation, a chance to discuss critical regulatory updates with industry leaders. But the irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to stand in front of an audience, championing fair and safe aviation practices, all while recovering from an ordeal that proved why those very practices were still so urgently needed. The next morning, the aviation conference was already in full swing by the time Naomi arrived at the convention center. The halls bustled with pilots, engineers, airline executives, and regulators. Her keynote address was scheduled for late morning, and she had hoped to slip in early for a quiet moment to prepare. But as she walked through the corridors, a tall man in a crisp suit approached her. "Miss Carter, I'm Martin Green from Pacific Air." He extended a hand. Naomi recognized the name immediately. He was a high-ranking executive at the airline she had flown with. "I heard about the incident on your flight," he said, his tone sincere. "I wanted to personally apologize and let you know that we are launching a full investigation." Naomi, taken aback by his directness, shook his hand. She hadn't expected this level of response so quickly. "Thank you," she replied, meeting his gaze, "though I wish it hadn't come to this." Naomi Carter studied Martin Green. the airline executive standing before her. His words sounded sincere. "We're committed to making sure something like this never happens again," he said, his expression reflecting genuine remorse. "We'll be reviewing our training protocols and implementing additional oversight to ensure passengers are treated with the respect they deserve." "I'm sorry you were subjected to this." Naomi nodded, gratitude flickering inside her. It didn't erase what had happened, but it reinforced something she deeply believed, that progress often emerges from conflict. This wasn't just about her experience. It was about ensuring that no one else had to endure what she did. A short while later, Naomi stood at the podium of the aviation conference, addressing a sizable audience. The exhibition hall buzzed with industry professionals, pilots, engineers, airline executives, safety regulators, and media personnel, all gathered to discuss the future of aviation. All eyes were on her. Naomi took a slow breath and spoke. "Aviation isn't just about mechanics and regulations," she began, her voice strong, resonating through the hall. "It's about people. About passengers, crew members, and every individual who places their trust in the skies." She paused, scanning the audience. "When we talk about safety, we cannot only mean physical safety, we must include emotional and psychological safety as well." A few heads nodded. Naomi continued, her tone unwavering. "Discrimination has no place in any airline's operations." She didn't explicitly recount what had happened to her just the day before, but the subtle hints were there, clear enough for anyone paying attention to recognize. A few murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. By the time she concluded, the applause was thunderous. As Naomi stepped off the stage, a wave of relief washed over her. She had used her platform not for personal grievance, but to address a deeper, systemic issue. Her phone buzzed with messages, colleagues praising her talk, fellow regulators requesting meetings, and journalists hoping for a comment on the viral social media post. She ignored the reporters, at least for now. The real work was just beginning. Later that afternoon, Naomi received a phone call from the airline's corporate office. Stepping into a quiet corner of the convention center, she answered. A measured voice greeted her. "Miss Carter, my name is Daniel Forsyth, and I'm a senior executive in customer relations. We wanted to reach out personally regarding your experience on Flight 9234. Naomi remained silent, waiting. "We'd like to invite you to a meeting with our senior leadership team," Daniel continued. "We're considering new inclusivity training programs for our flight crews, and we would greatly value your input. We understand you have unique expertise and insights that could help us make meaningful improvements." Naomi felt a flicker of hope. "That sounds promising," she replied. "I'd be happy to consult if it leads to tangible change." Daniel hesitated before adding, "Regarding Ms. Hayes, we've spoken with her. She has been placed on temporary administrative leave pending a full review. She may face disciplinary action, but we are also considering a restorative approach." Naomi's brows lifted slightly. "We believe in giving employees a chance to learn from their mistakes," Daniel explained, "provided they truly understand and regret the harm caused." A wave of relief coursed through Naomi. She had no desire to see someone's life destroyed, but she did want real accountability. "I'd like to be updated on that process," Naomi insisted, "and I want to be sure that other flight staff also benefit from comprehensive training. This isn't just about one person, it's about the system that allowed this to happen." "We absolutely agree," Daniel assured her. "We'll keep you in the loop." Naomi exhaled slowly. This was a start. Not a resolution, but the beginning of something meaningful. Over the following weeks, Naomi found herself both exhausted and gratified. The airline followed through on its promise to investigate thoroughly. She was invited to video conferences with senior airline leadership and civil rights advocates, discussing how to incorporate anti-bias training into standard flight crew education, stricter disciplinary guidelines for discriminatory behavior, improved passenger manifest verification to prevent racial profiling. Naomi used her expertise as an NASB director, but also her personal experience, because what happened to her should never happen to another passenger. Meanwhile, the airline issued a formal statement of apology directly to her, as well as a broader memo to its employees. The memo outlined specific changes, including mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all flight staff, improved verification procedures for first-class seating, new protocols for handling ticket discrepancies without public humiliation. But what truly surprised Naomi was what she learned next. One afternoon, Naomi received a letter from Victoria Hayes. It was unexpected. She hesitated before opening it, unsure of what she might read. Inside, Victoria admitted her fault. She acknowledged that her behavior had been influenced by unconscious bias and stress, and that her assumptions about Naomi were entirely unfounded. She expressed genuine remorse, and more importantly, she committed to undergoing training to correct her perspective. Naomi set the letter down, her emotions mixed. She wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. But she did believe in growth. If Victoria was truly willing to reflect and learn, then maybe, just maybe, this experience wouldn't be in vain. In the end, Naomi's turbulent flight wasn't just about her. It had become a catalyst for a larger conversation. One about fairness and dignity in air travel, the hidden biases that still persist, the responsibility airlines have to ensure their employees treat passengers with respect. It had been a journey riddled with frustration, discomfort, and anger, but it ended with a real chance for change. Naomi felt satisfied that this chapter had not only concluded with accountability, but with the potential to make the skies a little fairer for everyone. A single flight had descended into chaos, prejudice, and humiliation, transformed into a teachable moment, left ripple effects far beyond one cabin. Naomi Carter had stood her ground. She had flashed her NASB Director badge at precisely the right moment. And she had proven something important. You never truly know who's sitting next to you, or what they stand for. The turbulence she faced wasn't just in the air. It was embedded in a system that sometimes falters and must be held accountable. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred your emotions, made you reflect, or fueled your desire for change, like this video, share it with friends and family. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that spotlight injustice and celebrate those who dare to challenge it. Let's keep the conversation alive and strive for skies where every passenger is treated with dignity.